Hi, I'm Tim, he's Mike, and welcome to Around the Crown. Today we're discussing a topic near and dear to the hearts of Rolex and Rolex collectors, and that is open water. Today it's Rolex on the high seas and below. Mike, does the date July 29th, 1926 have any special associations for you?
Oh boy, that's a tough one.
Isn't that the year you were born?
I think it's close.
Yeah.
That was cold.
He's not that old. Close, but not quite. That was the day Rolex patented the Oyster case. And while it was not the first water-resistant watch, and the patent did have prior origins, it was Rolex that popularized this design. Fast forward a little bit more than a year, 1926, October to be specific, and a woman like Hans Wilsdorf with both British and German roots, Mercedes Gleitze, she swam the English Channel.
Yes.
But she did it with relatively little fanfare. Soon after, another woman made an apocryphal claim to have done it faster, and that was found out to be a hoax. So Gleitze had to go back because she was slimed by association. People assumed all the claims were false. Well, she didn't quite make it on the validation swim, but she did swim for about 10 and a half hours with a Rolex watch around her neck. Again, Hans Wilsdorf, he wanted to associate the watch with aquatic exploits, and he did. And in the process, created the first Rolex brand ambassador.
Exactly. And he also made it famous because when she did come out of the water, the press was there and free publicity took over, and oh my God, you're wearing a watch in the water, which was unheard of at the time. Watches were just getting out of the pockets, just getting into, and to get them in the water was certainly something that was never done. And it really did cement Rolex as to being associated with waterproof watches.
Absolutely, and she actually appeared in Rolex ads into the 21st century, so they were dearly grateful for the opportunity. And in case you have any doubts, she later set a record for swimming for 46 consecutive hours. So consider the deed done. Fast forward to 1933, we have the Oyster case, the perpetual rotor winding system. We create the Oyster Perpetual, which is not only still in the catalog, it was arguably the archetype of every sports watch that came after, as well as the groundwork for the big breakthrough of the 1950s.
Yes, and the early 1950s, while there were other sports watches and dive watches, Omega had a diving watch, Blancpain, 50 Fathoms, had a diving watch. But Rolex introduced this diving watch that suddenly became the most iconic design in watches. And still to this day, if you go back to the 50s, you can see the DNA, you can see the design, everything about it is almost exactly the same. And almost every other watchmaker at some point copied that design. And it just became so significant, a style with the dial, with the bezel, with the crown, with the bracelets. It's just amazing that back then it was such an iconic breakthrough.
Yes, the Submariner was not the first rotating bezel Rolex sports watch, but it was the first modern format dive watch from Rolex, and the Blancpain and the Rolex were in development at the same time. So in some ways it was a bit of a tie, but only the Rolex became a pop culture phenomenon and an icon on the wrists of, among all people, 007 through multiple generations.
Multiple generations. He really made it a celebrity icon. It was a tool watch up until that point, but when the coolest guy in the world wears your watch, suddenly the Submariner became the coolest watch to have. It was just like the Aston Martin, it was just like the suits, and it was the Rolex that just became culturally significant.
And of course, it had real-world credibility. There were Comex editions, there were Comex exclusive references like the 5514, there were mill subs. The world of the Submariner is vast, and I almost think it's a collection unto itself. There's Rolex, there's the Submariner, and you can be into both or you can be into one. But if you're into the sub, I think that is a lifelong collecting theme by itself.
Without a doubt, because you have the variants. And to us, the sub was a no-date watch. And then down the road, we added a date, so just came a variation, and it's the most popular one today. But that true-to-life self of that sub, that original non-date, just straightforward functional watch, has continued till today, and in all those variations, and made for professionals, made for Comex, Jacques Cousteau's always wearing Rolexes. All the guys who were famous in the water always had a Rolex.
I think it's also important to note that while the sub went mainstream, out of the same period, we had perhaps the most specialized of Rolex dive watches, and that was the Deep Sea Special, a watch that was originally crafted with a view to pushing the limits of dive watch technology. In its original iteration in 1953, with the bathyscaphe Trieste, it traveled to the bottom of the Mediterranean 3,150 meters. That was good, impressive for the time, but it was nothing but a warm-up for what came later. First, let me remind you that this watch was a monster. In its period, it was 36 millimeters thick, of which 18 millimeters was a plexiglass crystal. It was technically a 43 millimeter watch, but it had an enormous shingle-like case that was 62 millimeters from lug to lug. Oh, and I should also mention, they made two-tone versions of it. Most of them in the 50s were prototypes, very low production. Following a world record dive to over 35,000 feet on the Trieste in the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench, Rolex then made 35 commemorative editions. They were basically replicas of the original that went out to museums, scientific institutions, university science departments. The one that went to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, that today is in the Smithsonian. And in some ways, the watch is still with us, as the enormous plexiglass profile inspired the ladle Corum bubble to the millimeter, right down to the loft of the plexiglass. Corum, in 2000, paid an unofficial tribute to Rolex's least famous diving watch.
The thing that's amazing, and the Sea Dwellers, again, launching in the 60s, became really that professional diver's watch. But Rolex always took it to the next level.
Yes.
And they were always doing experiments and trying to figure out better materials and better ways to produce this because, again, the pressures of that depth, unfathomable is really the only way to do it. It's truly impressive what they've done, but it's also been one of those watches that's evolved so many times because it's so hard to make a watch that's that robust, that's wearable.
Yes. It was not wearable. And I'll add that when it dove to the bottom of the Challenger Deep with Jacques Piccard and U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh, it was on the outside of the submersible. So it's sized for a submarine.
Yes.
Or submersible, I should say. And this was an unbelievable watch. Not only was it a record breaker, not only is it in the Smithsonian, but it's performed impressively at auction. One last November at Phillips actually went for $1 million, which, given the history and the rarity, seems kind of low, but still an impressive result for a watch that was originally designed basically as scientific equipment.
It really was scientific equipment. And then they did make it into production pieces, and some of the most iconic Rolexes today are Sea Dwellers. I mean, they've certainly done distinctive things on it. We always talk about double reds. When it first came out in a production piece, just super collectible today. And then we went into the deep seas later on, and we could have long discussions about the deep seas and the wearability and the changes they've made over the years.
And the deep sea, actually, I think if you combine the Deep Sea Special as like the grandfather and the Deep Sea Dweller as the father, then the grandson is going to be the Deep Sea Challenger that was built the Deep Sea Challenge, properly speaking, that was built in 5 copies for James Cameron during his March 2012 dive. He went back to the Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench. He has a new submarine now, the Deep Sea Challenger. And if you've ever wondered why a Deep Sea Dweller has that green script on the dial, that's the color of the sub. He took this new watch, which was rated to almost 40,000 feet or 12,000 meters, down to the bottom, once again on the outside of the submersible. And other than James Cameron, I'm not sure anyone not named Rolex owns one of these.
Not that I'm aware. I've never heard of anyone being in the wild. And, I know James Cameron was so honored by their commitment to science, to their commitment to the oceans, and what Rolex has done over the years, that he was so proud of that piece. And it was really, we used to get calls all the time going, "Oh, I want one." And we're like, "Yeah, you and everyone else."
Yeah, I mean, you have to have the wrist for it, first of all, because we have another watch sized for a Kraken. It was 51.4 millimeters in diameter. The crystal, now sapphire, was 14.3 millimeters, and the watch itself was 28.5 millimeters thick, which makes an Omega Planet Ocean seem like an ultra thin. With only 5 made, we'll never have the pleasure, but what a dream.
What a dream. No, it really is cool. And then they went into the deep sea productions. And again, I love big watches.
Yes.
Always have. And I got a deep sea as soon as it came out. It had the coolest dial I thought I had seen on any Rolex of the time. That kind of changing color from black to blue. Just an amazing piece. But they have redesigned that watch now for the third time because it's not a terribly wearable watch.
No. Here's the thing, though. It is a very charismatic watch. And if you want to learn more about the dive that James Cameron took with the Rolex and you want to see the Rolex in action, he actually made a dramatized documentary that came out almost concurrent with the release of the Deep Sea D Blue in late 2014.
Exactly.
So you can see a little bit more about how all of this worked. But I guess that makes the watch a movie star.
It should make it a movie star. And I always loved wearing it. My kids hated it because I would wear it and always hit them with it or bang into them trying to play sports and leave dents, because I mean, it is a tank. And then they changed the bracelet to try to make it more comfortable. And now we've had a third iteration come out this year, which I still haven't seen in person, but I'm dying to see the variations.
Yeah, probably no Rolex watch that plays to such a niche has been so subdivided in reference numbers in such a short production life.
Very much so, yes. It's evolved very much in a short period of time, which is not like Rolex. Rolex usually makes a design, they tweak it, and then it runs for 20 years.
Yes.
This is the third iteration, and I'm kind of surprised with that, but I understand it, owning one and wearing it, because it's not perfect, but I love it. I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite Rolexes, but it's definitely every once in a while you're like, God, this thing's just so big.
Yeah, and if you're wondering, the crystal on that watch is only 5.5 millimeters thick. I think it's important to mention when talking about Rolex on the high seas that virtually all of the Panerai combat watches of the 1940s and 50s were made by Rolex. And there's no doubt about this. They have Rolex serials on them, patent numbers, they have Rolex makers marks, hallmarks. They were Rolex watches. Panerai occasionally did some modification. Early on, they might have added some dials of their own design, but these watches were made by Rolex and its suppliers.
Without a doubt. And Rolex was, again, they were the leading producer of dive watches or any kind of watch that you wanted for the ocean. So when Panerai was having supply for the Italian Navy, they went to the subcontractor who was Rolex, who would subcontract back in those.
And they were Oyster cased. They were very similar to Rolex Oyster cased pocket watches and wrist watches made in the 1930s. They used the Rolex Oyster case design with the screwed in case back with the screw down crown. Those crowns were Rolex patent numbers. The case back said Rolex. And they used Rolex modified Code-Bear 618 pocket watch movements internally, which means when you take these watches apart or you see them vivisected in the modern era by auction houses, they're loaded with Rolex content, and they are, properly speaking, Rolex watches. I mean, they're not Panerai modified Rolex watches in most cases. All Panerai did was issue them as the contractor to the Italian Navy.
Correct. Exactly. They got them produced and delivered them because they made equipments for the Navy at that point. Really didn't make a lot of watches. They outsourced everything. So that was the contract. But it's interesting to see the connection. There's always been military uses for Rolex watches. Famously, I mean, if you think back to the 70s and 80s, so many guys would buy them in PXs. So many guys would buy them all over the world. And that was the thing, to buy a Rolex watch that would last you a lifetime and you could take into the ocean and anywhere in the world.
Yeah. And it's also important to remember that there was a lot of action in the Mediterranean during World War II that involved these pieces. So yes, you've got black boat squadrons in Britain, you've got mill subs, you've got that heritage, but you've also got the Italian naval heritage with the Decima MAS, MAS, the guys who rode the manned SLCs, the Soloro Alanta Corsa, the manned torpedoes, and exactly, the earliest amphibious tactical forces. They were pioneering in that regard. They were not the only ones, but they were part of that first generation of what we would describe today as amphibious special forces, much like OSS, Navy SEALs later on, just very advanced tactical units. Back at a time when a water-resistant watch of 30 meters, which is what these were, was sufficient to go into combat.
Yeah, the standard has definitely been risen over the years when we see our sea dwellers today that go down. You know, I don't like to go in the deep end of my pool with it, but
yeah,
you know,
well, we would consider like a dress watch level of water resistance was a big deal back then.
Correct, it really was, because nobody else was doing the technical job that Rolex was doing and able to build those watches to such high standards. Even the Submariner, before the Sea Dweller came out, had gotten down to 660 feet, which was big back then.
And it's also important to remember that in the December 1941 raid on Alexandria Harbor that disabled 2 battleships, among others, these watches were in play, and that famous amphibious action helped to inspire the later British commando raid on the German battleship Tirpitz. So you look at where these Panerai watches were, made by Rolex, branded Rolex, powered by Rolex modified movements, and this was a pivotal time for the development of tactical forces, and there would be echoes through history, and Panerai was right there at the beginning of it.
Absolutely. The early on was definitely tool watches, and then as Rolex evolved, as they have through the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, they became much more of a yachtsman's watch. And certainly, the Yacht-Master became famous, and all of those watches that nowadays, almost every watch that Rolex makes is available to be used on the high seas.
And I think it's important to note that a lot of old things later came back. For instance, Panerai in 1997, fresh off the purchase by Vendome Group, had the parts for 61 PAM-21s, the platinum-cased replica of the Rolex era 3646 combat watch. And I can't say for a fact that those were really Rolex-modified Côte d'Ivoire movements. They were Côte d'Ivoire movements, but Panerai made sure as hell to have a sapphire display case back over a bridge that said Rolex on it.
Yeah, so you could see it.
They wanted to attach themselves to that history, and that was the first Panerai Special Series watch, and they wanted to tie themselves to the Rolex era as much as possible. But I'll also say this. You mentioned the Yacht-Master. Initially, the Yacht-Master was envisioned as a sort of seagoing Paul Newman. Starting with reference 6239 and later actually a weird mono-counter version of the 6262.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a chronograph.
There were 2 or 3, and I think I've seen 3. I can verify that I've seen 3 different examples of a 1960 prototype that essentially turned the then unpopular Yacht-Master into a regatta timer.
Yes. No, they really wanted to get into that sailing world, and they did, in essence. But again, it's one of those...
It took a while, though.
It took a while, for sure it did. It was not a huge success immediately, but it's become one of those things that's been appreciated over time.
Yeah, they owned the Yacht-Master trademark for decades before they used it on a production watch. And that 1960s watch, if I had to describe it, the dials were made by Singer, so, think Paul Newman dials, that's the Singer exotic dial. Singer made other dials, but the Paul Newman version's the most famous. Yeah. These Yacht-Master dials were like nautical Paul Newmans. They had a lot of the same features, the same telling details, but they were calibrated to time matches within a regatta, individual sailing races. And what's funny is that you had this regatta timer that was designed to basically measure things that were very short-term for vehicles going very slow, and they still had the race car calibrated tachymeters that were at 200 or 300. There were both versions. You had to be pretty good with mental decimals to use that to time a sailboat race.
That's a great point. Marketing people design the dials, not the functional people.
And of course, the Yacht-Master debuted as a more luxurious nautical watch in 1992. We got the Yacht-Master II, the most complex Rolex ever, in 2007. That one's a bit more contentious, but as they say, the rest is history.
Very contentious for a Rolex model that's certainly on the seas, because the other ones are much more traditional. That one definitely was a little more on the outside, and definitely in a period where Rolex was making watches that were a little louder. Without a question. I think today we've gone back a little bit more to some of the more conservative designs. That one was definitely one of the bolder designs they came out with.
So think about it. Rolex first launched prototype Yacht-Master chronographs in the late 60s. Didn't get around to actually marketing one until 2007. At Rolex, once the bug is planted, it will eventually, the seed will grow, so to speak. And it's fascinating to see the Yacht-Master II still around, and one of the most interesting Rolex pieces, because yeah, the Daytona's a legend, and it's true, maybe if you're racing cars, you can find some use for it. I think it's great as a trophy. I don't know if you're ever going to use it actually racing cars, but if you win a race, you get the watch. Here's the thing. The Yacht-Master II is the most practical Rolex chronograph. You can program a countdown from 10 minutes. That's great for everything. Let me count down to the end of the intermission. Let me count down to the end of Junior's timeout for being bad. Let me count down to the end of, like, my grill because I'm cooking fish and this is time sensitive. I'm making fish tacos. They don't keep. So, a 10-minute programmable countdown timer can be very, very useful.
Yes.
Even if, like me, you stay high and dry and you have no interest in sailing.
Absolutely true. And I think 99% of the people who ever bought that watch have no interest in sailing. It was just a great size. It was bold. It was truly that kind of high-level Rolex.
And the funny thing is, every single watch we discussed is part of the ongoing legacy of that original 1926 Rolex patent for the Oyster case.
Which I think is why we love Rolex so much, is because the history, the DNA, you can feel it through. They don't really vary very much. Every once in a while, we'll go off on a tangent, but it's really traditional. You can see the history right on your wrist.
That's a fact, and it continues. That's our lap around the crown.